So about a year ago, I posted a video in which I proposed a series of videos exploring H.P. Lovecraft and Stephen King's views of history and how history interacted with their work. And I wasn't able to really follow through on that at the time because I had a new job and I was very busy and I didn't have all my books available and things like that. So it never left my mind though, and so I'm back to give you some of my early thoughts on this. And some of this is coming out of a book I'm working on, on really Lovecraft and his views of history. So here's how we want to start. I want to say that there's really one way of looking at Atlantic history, the history of the interactions between Africa, America, and Europe, and how they created various cultures. You can look at it as kind of a conflict between three or maybe really four stories. We can really call these the Black Atlantic, the White Atlantic, and two Red Atlantics. So the Black Atlantic refers to what is perhaps maybe one of the more well-known stories of Atlantic history, and that is the story of the African diaspora. This would be the relationship between Africa, Europe, and America, the rise and fall of the slave trade, the emergence of plantation economies in the Atlantic world, the struggle against those by the African diaspora, the creation of African American cultures in the Americas, or Afro-European cultures, or transformed cultures in Africa due to these interactions, and then the struggles of the African diaspora within white settler societies. So that's a huge history that's been detailed by many, many historians. Now, the White Atlantic is the view of Atlantic history centering really is created over the First and Second World Wars, I want to say. The Anglo-American alliances culminating in NATO, for instance. Some historians may see the most important tale of the Atlantic history being the expansion of English civilization to North America, the expansion of British political institutions, and the disunity and reunification of Anglo-American cultures. Essentially, the American Revolution is kind of like a breaking up of that. And then you have the emergence of North American kind of political and cultural independence, and then some kind of reunification in the early 20th century in the context of the World Wars. Now, the Red Atlantic is a little harder to define because there's really kind of two stories we can fit under this title. But it's best described maybe by Peter Linebaugh and Marcus Rediker in their classic story of Atlantic history called The Many-Headed Hydra, a book I really do recommend. Now, this refers to this book's about the struggle of the multi-ethnic working people in combat with emerging capitalism. So you kind of look at these two stories in parallel, emerging capitalism and the struggle against it by various working people. Now, of course, the second way of reading the Red Atlantic, obviously, is the story of the genocide of native peoples and the conquest of a continent. All right, so this video is about H.P. Lovecraft's concept of the White Atlantic. This doesn't mean he wasn't aware of other concepts of Atlantic history. I want to really look at his early writings, especially during World War I, some of his early letters, and examine them with a window to Atlantic history to try to understand maybe what his mindset was. We're not going to look at too many of his stories here. He, of course, didn't write that many stories, and certainly not many were published. But what we really have is a lot of rich material in his letters and some poems that talk about this. But he is certainly very much aware of other concepts of Atlantic history. I don't think he'd call them the Black, Red, and White Atlantic. But, if you read, for instance, the case of Charles Dexter Ward, that's all about the slave trade, essentially, or the sins of the slave trade and the inheritance of those sins. We'll talk about that certainly at some point in the future. You got certainly the fear of diversity in stories like The Street revealed there, and we'll talk about all these in the future. But I'll explore those things in later videos. What I really want to look at now is his fascination with the Anglo-American story and how it really shaped his worldview. All right, so H.P. Lovecraft, now very, very famous, a pulp writer from the early 20th century, if you don't know, a pioneer in what we can call cosmic horror. And his career really is in the space between the two world wars. Of course, he was dead before the Second World War began, and his writing goes back a little bit before World War I, but pretty much most of his career is between the wars. And each of these wars placed the United States in transatlantic alliances with England and France. Now, Lovecraft's opinion about this transatlantic solidarity changed significantly over that period. During World War I, Lovecraft embraced an Anglo-American identity, praising British culture, the British aristocratic government, and seeing himself essentially as a displaced Englishman. For a while, he would even close some of his letters to his dear friends with, quote, "God save the king." It was a reactionary identity, certainly at odds with the American continental and frontier history, which is also something that was being developed, especially in the 19th century, right? We think of Turner's frontier thesis, for instance, that you got this idea of American history looking to the frontier, looking to the continent, looking to their own kind of culture, maybe through diversity, maybe through the frontier is another way of doing that. But Lovecraft's kind of quirky way of looking at history was prescient because the United States in the 20s would enter a period of xenophobia and racism, shaped in part by transatlantic identities and this kind of Anglo-American idea or Anglo-Saxon identity, and worries about the decline of Anglo-American white civilization. Now, Lovecraft never lived to see World War II, but he was affected by the rise of fascism, economic depression, ideological changes in the world, ideological realignment, and a growing technocracy. He died essentially a supporter of the New Deal, toying with some kind of gradual socialism as a way of sustaining kind of social order. A little more moderate on race issues, perhaps. Certainly he embraced a little bit more diverse and open Atlantic America. I don't want to, show him as a redeemed racist too much, though, but there are changes in his views. He supported social legislation, but this was tainted by an open fondness for authoritarianism, a disdain for democracy, and a belief that creativity required a strong civilization that could keep diversity and so-called barbarism from creeping into society. Now, while one of his letters praising fascism, penned to fellow speculative fiction author Robert E. Howard in 1934, is not extant, we know Howard's response, though, so we know that Lovecraft was in some way praising fascism in almost utopian terms. Howard wrote, and again, this is 1934, "I do not condemn the reforms you say would be possible under fascism. I simply do not believe that they would exist under a fascist government. Of course, you can draw glowing pictures of a fascist utopia. Of course, you can say that any type of fascism you advocate is without despotism and persecution of intellectual freedom. You might as well say you advocate a cobra without its venom." End quote. So this is Howard responding to something Lovecraft said. And again, we don't have that letter, so we don't know quite what he said, but it sounds like he was essentially praising fascism because for Lovecraft, that was a better path, for instance, to order. I think my overall view here is that Lovecraft was maybe more attracted to social order and kind of a broad concept of an ordered, stable civilization, and he was less ideologically focused on whether you got there through some kind of state socialism or fascism. I think he would have taken either if it got to the larger end of a stable civilization. But we'll think about that. Now, during American involvement in World War I, going back, the young writer created a series of poems proclaiming his bold support for the war effort, in particular the alliance of the United States and England. He says nothing about the other allies. He doesn't say much about the Russians, Italians, and French, except in maybe some pejorative ways. I think, in his view, they sort of got in the way of a long overdue North Atlantic consilience. He declared a 1917 Independence Day poem on this theme. He proclaimed that the revolution over a century earlier was a schism between America and the, quote, brothers of Britain. The conflict had to be set aside to fight the, quote, black perils that challenged Anglo-American civilization. Now, the poem doesn't quite welcome Britain at long last to the ranks of free nations. The image instead is that of two nations that have always been pursuing the same project, quote, "For the friends of the right in the field side by side, from the fabric of freedom no hand can divide," end quote. Lovecraft presents the American Revolution as a so-called strife that sundered an empire. Now, that Lovecraft embraced such an Anglophile vision does not surprise those who have read his works. It's awash with sentiment, memories of families looking back to glorious days of the past. Now, Lovecraft's personal golden age, the time he looked back to most favorably, was the 18th century. Sometimes he talks about the height of Rome in those terms, but really it was the 18th century. This was before revolution and industrialization fractured the social order, in his view. However, for a xenophobic Anglophile like Lovecraft, the 18th century is a surprising century to emulate. for it was in many ways the first global century, and much of that globalism was spurred by the British Empire, British slave traders, and British navies commanding the seas. More than any other century, it was the 18th that brought whites and blacks together in the New World through plantation slavery and the Atlantic slave trade. It was the 18th century that turned a handful of English colonies in mainland North America, dependent on England, into diverse but autonomous societies, in part through massive immigration of Irish, Scots, Germans, and others. When Lovecraft, through his fiction, warns us not to pick too much of the scab of history, what is he referring to here? Does he mean the idealized Anglo-American civilization of 1917, the one he talks about in his poem, or is he talking about the rough, conflicted, and diverse history of Atlantic cross-currents? That is the question I think we need to grapple with to understand Lovecraft fully. Now, the most important international relationship for Lovecraft was the ties between white America and Great Britain. From his earliest writings, he was obsessed with his own place within an imagined Anglo-American Atlantic world. Before U.S. foreign policy pushed a permanent alliance between the U.S. and Europe, Lovecraft was imagining a special relationship across the Atlantic. In parallel to the discourse on degeneration in Lovecraft stories is his personal belief that he was tied to English greatness through an unblemished line of descent from England. Now, during World War I, Lovecraft worked especially hard to conceive of a North Atlantic as a single cultural unit united by blood. In a 1916 poem, An American to Mother England, Lovecraft expressed his pride in this relationship, his fear of racial decline, and his belief that he was part of an Atlantic-wide civilization. I'm going to quote here this at length. Can distant birth and distant dwelling drain the ancestral blood that warms the loyal vein? Isle of my fathers, hear the filial song of him whose sources but to thee belong. World-conquering mother, by thy mighty hand was carved the savage wilds my native land. Thy matchless sons the firm foundation laid. Thy matchless arts the nascent nation made. By thy just laws the young republic grew, and through thy greatness kindred greatness knew. What man that springs from thy untainted line, but sees Columbia's virtues all as thine? Whilst nameless multitudes upon our shore from the dim corners of creation pour, whilst mongrel slaves crawl thither to partake of Saxon liberty they could not make. Now, in this poem, Lovecraft accepts a definition of Atlantic solidarity rooted in the struggles of the United States and Great Britain in the first half of the 20th century. In a historiographical sense, Lovecraft's poem is about the very origins of Anglo-American Atlantic identity, centered on this question: what makes white America akin to Great Britain? What is the nature of the civilization we are defending? But rather than ask these hard questions, Lovecraft relied on sentimental ties of blood, writing, "Course with the bounding blood of British sires, from British bodies, minds, and souls I come." Now, Lovecraft was accepting an Anglo-American definition of the Atlantic world as his personal history. An American to Mother England sees the American Revolution as a simple coming of age. The 19th century effort by American writers to create a unique new world culture, independent from English culture, was an anomalous period, breaking up a unified cultural zone across North Atlantic. However, Lovecraft was well aware of another narrative of Atlantic history, characterized by conquest and slavery and inevitable mixing of races. In a very real sense, this vision of Atlantic history has deeper roots than the Anglo-American narrative of an English-speaking cultural community. The origin of the Black Atlantic go back as far as the plantation economy, as black slaves imagined and wrote about their homeland. Both the colonization movement and the Black missionary movement encouraged African Americans to return to Africa. And I'd be very critical of the colonization movement. I've been recently studying Lincoln's writings, and he was a big believer in colonization until quite late. And this essentially was an effort to take these people's homeland away from them and say, you're not part of the New World. That's nonsense, of course. But there were African Americans who were attracted to this idea of back to Africa and having some imagination of Africa, all the way up through to Marcus Garvey and even to some degree the Black Power movement of the 60s. So anyways, back to Lovecraft. Lovecraft attempted a family history and autobiography in a 1915 letter to Maurice W. Moe, one of his friends and common correspondents. He extends his family history, particularly on the Phillips side, the P part of H.P. Lovecraft, back to England, calling that line typical New England Yankees. More importantly, in this letter, he establishes almost dotting admiration for English cultural traditions. Quote, I cannot even now excuse the revolution of America from England, and through the influences of hereditary, am at heart an Englishman despite my American birth. My knowledge of the world is no more than could be expected from one reared in seclusion. With this, we have a very fascinating paradox. Lovecraft believed himself to be transatlantic in his heart, but profoundly isolated and parochial. This is the same paradox that helps us, I think, interpret his work. Lovecraft attempted to live out his relationship through his hopes to participate in the First World War. Lovecraft himself never served, but he did make a serious effort to enlist in the military once the United States joined the war in 1917. His letters revealed some of his agony over not being able to fight alongside his imagined compatriots. During the First World War, Lovecraft embraced more strongly than ever his British heritage and made a full-throated defense of American intervention on behalf of Britain. In a letter to Reinhard Kleiner, he wrote, quote, I shall not stoop to explain that I am an invalid who would certainly be fighting under the Union Jack if able, but shall have plenty to say about the decadent cowardice responsible for the propagation of peace ideas. Peace is the ideal of a dying nation. End quote. In a later letter to the same friend, Lovecraft played with the idea of fighting in the First World War, connecting his vocal claims that the defense of Great Britain, or his vocal claims for the defense of Great Britain, into action. Lovecraft documented his attempt to join the National Guard with hopes of being sent to the front. Despite clearing the medical review, Lovecraft was frustrated in his efforts to enlist, in part because of the intervention of his mother. The First World War was a formative period in terms of Lovecraft's overall philosophy, and he managed to connect global events to both his ideas on cosmic horror and to his ideas on race. A November 1915 letter to Reinhard Kleiner shows one of Lovecraft's more upfront and ugly attacks on interracial breeding and the belief in the supremacy of the so-called Teutonic race. Quote, as to races, I deem it most proper to recognize the divisions into which nature has grouped mankind. Science shows us the infinite superiority of the Teutonic Aryans over all others, and it therefore becomes us to see that his ascendancy shall remain undisputed. Any racial mixture can but lower the result. End quote. He tied this belief to the struggle in the First World War, which he saw to some degree as a wasteful civil war among the race, which he called, quote, an elaborately staged racial suicide. In a later letter to Kleiner, he wrote, quote, and the more I study the question, the more firmly I am convinced that the one supreme race is the Teuton. Observe the condition of the British Isles. The English are wholly Teutonic and therefore dominant. The Welsh, who have no Teutonic blood, are of little account. Now, in his pessimism about the war during the 1917 collapse of the Russian Empire, Lovecraft again took to seeing the First World War as a type of race war, albeit an unfortunate racial civil war. The difference between the Anglo-Americans and the Germans, Lovecraft did not say too much about the French allies. It was that the Germans were actually a pure descendant of the Teutonic race, writing that nothing can withstand the might of the Teuton. Teutonic blood conquered the western wilderness and gave America an instant place among the great nations of the globe. End quote. Now, the expected failure of Britain and America, Lovecraft wrote, was entirely blamed on the grotesque fallacy, that's his words, grotesque fallacy, that America was stronger as a melting pot. The end result of the Civil War among the Teutonic races would be the decline of global civilization. All right, so that does it. That, through Lovecraft's, a little bit of his poetry and through his letters from the period about World War I, I think we have a pretty clear idea about his overall view of Atlantic history, particularly what we'll call the white Atlantic history, right? And we see very early on he has very strongly established ideas based on scientific racism, based on a broader cultural unity across the North Atlantic. So that's it for now. In my next video on H.P. Lovecraft, I'll perhaps look at some of his early stories. I might go a little bit deeper into some of his letters and talk a little bit more about these issues. But my overall goal here is to maybe go into some of his actual stories that maybe kind of develop on this theme. So if you enjoyed this video, please join this community, and hopefully I'll be more more rapid in my production of videos than I have been in the past year. Thank you for your patience if you have been looking forward to this series. So I'll be back shortly with some more content on Lovecraft. Please subscribe and share this, and let other people know, other people who might be interested in a deeper reading of Lovecraft's fiction and writings. Or I'll also get to some Stephen King work as well, looking at his, because I think it's got a very different view of history. And if you want to know more about that, you can find my video called The Old Stand Watch, where I kind of lay out my overall thesis about why I think it's interesting to look at King and Lovecraft side by side in terms of their view of history. So thanks again for watching.